Chapter 3, Creating Anglo-America, 1660 to 1750. Now, before I get started, I would like to apologize to you for the phone ringing and for my dog barking on the last lecture. I perhaps should have re-recorded, but I just hope it wasn't too distracting for you. That being said, I know you've been sitting around and wondering about this. Where did we get our form of government from? Now, I mean, by our form of government, I mean United States. And where did those English colonists get the idea or the desire for self-rule? And when you get right down to it, our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution are a direct result of events that happened in England decades ago. And by decades, I probably should say centuries. Back in 1066 Common Era, the Normans conquered England. And prior to this time, England had not been unified, of course. There was a lot of little basic, I guess you'd almost call them city-states. There were a lot of little petty kings around, no one king ruling everything. A few years later, in 1189 Common Era, Henry I and Henry II, who had tried to unify England and bring it under one rule, but not real successful. It's still an awful lot of pulling away. They came up with something called the Uniform Code of Law, because prior to this time, every shower, every little inlet had their own laws, and nothing was written down. But Henrys I and II decided that we needed a uniform code of law that would be the same law in northern England as it was in southern England, and it's going to develop into something called the common law system. Now, these laws are not necessarily written down, but they're going to be common for the entire country. A few years later, during one of the Crusades, King Richard the Lionhearted was away and captured, and while he was gone, his brother John is ruling England. And of course, this is during the time, as I said, of King Richard the Lionhearted and King John and Robin Hood and the Merry Men. It's all very romantic and a legend. But the fact that John was ruling England in Richard's absence is not legend. And John was a very, very bad king. Very autocratic. He couldn't get along with his nobles. He couldn't get along with anybody. So the nobles got together and forced John to sign something called the Magna Carta. And it was a document that, in effect, gave 60 concessions from the king. And the one that was the most important was that the king was not above the law. He had to obey the law just like you and I do. It also created something called a Great Council to advise the king, which is going to metamorphose into something called the Parliament, in which there's going to be checks and balances against the king's rule. Now, this organization called the Parliament is going to be divided into two sections. One's going to be called the House of Lords, or to equate it to ours, it'd be the Senate. And to belong to the House of Lords, you didn't have to get elected. You just had to be of noble birth. And the House of Commons is called an elected assembly, but the term House of Commons is really misleading, because common people, the ordinary farmer, did not get elected. It was usually a noble who was elected, but the key being that it was an elected assembly. Now, the English kings and the nobles are in a continual power struggle. The absolutist tendencies of the king versus the legislative demanding rights of the nobles. But the House of Commons, as I said, had the power of the purse, which is in effect the power to tax. And this gave them quite a bit of whip hand over the king, because they had to pay the king's salary. The king had to go through them to get money to start wars and to make up armies. So that the House of Commons had a lot of power. But while all this struggle is going on, the tugs of war and the changes going on in England and the monarchy, England's neglecting their colonies. Now, King James I, the man who became king after Elizabeth died, was an absolutist, and he's a Presbyterian from Scotland. He hated the Puritans. And in all honesty, he did persecute them mercilessly. And because of it, the Puritans migrated in what we call a massive migration, or our text calls it the Great Migration, to the colonies, or the New World, over a period of 30 years. Now, King James I ruled for 22 years, and FYI, this is the king who is responsible for having the King James Version of the Bible written. He ruled for 22 years, and when he died, his son Charles became king. And Charles is an absolutist, and he's even more of an absolutist than his father, and he's continually battling Parliament over taxation. He doesn't think Parliament or anybody has the right to tell him what to do. And for 11 years, they're locked in battle, and the king's doing things that is illegal. And finally, the people, the Puritans and the nobles, have had enough. So there's a civil war. A farmer by the name of Oliver Cromwell, who turns out to be a military genius, almost on the par of Napoleon, leads the military forces, and sometimes he leads them into battle singing hymns. But they defeated the king and arrested him, and they had a trial, and he lost the trial, and he was beheaded. He's the only English king to ever be beheaded. And his family flees and goes to France to live at the mercy of the king of France. Well, Cromwell doesn't like the way things are going, so he takes over the government, and for 15 years he rules as a dictator, although he has a fancy title called the Lord Protectorate. Now, in his defense, he did institute many reforms. One of his sweeping ones that I liked was education for the young boys and girls. He released from prison some of the political prisoners. He extended trade. He was trying his best to make England a truly Christian country, as he thought Christians should be. Well, this kind of rankled a lot of the nobles and a lot of the public as well. And when Cromwell died and his son tried to take over, and he was not the man his father was. And so the nobles contacted Charles the First son in France, who's going to be called Charles II, and invited him to come back to England and become king. Because in all honesty, we got to thinking, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have a king. This doesn't rank very well. Well, why would Charles II want to return to the country that beheaded his father? Well, he did have to make some concession and give up some more kingly power, if you would. But it was better to be king in his own country than living at the behest of the king of France. He ruled peacefully for 25 years, primarily by not making any waves and letting Parliament run the country. But there was no children. So when he died, they asked his younger brother, James, to come over to be king. Now, this is where I had an awful hard time. I can't imagine what Parliament was thinking. If they had looked at James a little bit closer, they would have realized it was a very bad mistake. Now, I know he's noble blood, and he's the son of a king, but he's Catholic. He's married to a Catholic woman. He's 52 years old, and he hates the English for what they did to his father. So, I mean, it's a bad scenario. The only thing I can figure out is they must have thought at 52 he's not going to live very long. So he comes over here, and he's ruling the country, and all of a sudden, when people come to work in the palace one morning, and they see the queen laying there in bed with a baby in her arms. Now, no one knew she was pregnant. There was no evidence that she had given birth. There was no bloody sheets. No one had been in attendance. And she said that she was afraid she couldn't carry the baby, so she hadn't told anybody. And she delivered by herself. Well, are you going to call the queen a liar? Are you going to call the king a liar when the king has the power to off with your head? No, but it puts the Parliament in a very bad position, because not only do we have a Catholic king and a Catholic queen, we also have a brand new Catholic baby. And it looks like that the country is going to go back to being Catholic if something isn't done. So Parliament gets together and they contact the daughter of James and ask her if she would consider taking the throne if her father was deposed. And she said, not unless you offer the throne to my husband too, who happened to be William of Orange. And at first they said no, and then finally they said, okay, we got to get rid of your dad, basically, because Mary and William are Protestant, and William is thrilled to death, even though William's father and Mary's mother are brother and sister. They're really first cousins, but that's beside the point. Excuse me. William was thrilled to death to become King of England, because this meant that he could use England's money to fight the Catholics on the continent. So when he and his army landed, they were welcomed, and King James is forced to give up his crown and flee in what we call the Bloodless Revolution, or the Glorious Revolution, because nobody was really killed. So William and Mary jointly rule for a number of years, and Mary dies first, and then her husband dies a few years later as a result of blood poisoning from a broken leg. But they have no children either. And when they became king and queen, they also gave up more rights. So, I mean, every time we get a new king or queen, it seems like they have to give up more rights as a king. So they asked Anne, Mary's younger sister, to become queen. Now she's a widow, and she's had 15 children, but none of them are alive. And she's older, but they really don't want to go to the German side of the family. So Anne becomes queen, and oh, everybody loves Anne. She sits around and sews on samplers and goes to teas and things and entertains foreign dignitaries, but she lets Parliament do the running of the country. So Parliament loved her, and the public loved her. They called her Queen Mum. And then when she dies with no children, of course, we have no choice but to go to the Hanover branch of the family in Germany, and we begin our first of the three King Georges. Now, the colonists never did think of themselves as Americans. They always considered themselves Englishmen. And to repeat some of what we had in the last chapter, that all colonial governments are similar in the fact that the joint stock company, the stockholders decide who's going to be governor. In the corporate colonies, the governor is elected by the people, and in the royal colony, the king appoints the governor. No colony ever starts out as a royal colony. It only becomes a royal colony when the king pulls its charter. And I cannot repeat often enough, the colonists believed they had all the rights of Englishmen in this new world. The governor, whether he's appointed or elected, he's a lot of power. He's got the power of the veto. He's the head of the militia. He enforces laws. He appoints officials. He gives out contracts. But he gets his pay from the elected assembly. Here again, the elected assembly has the power of the purse. The laws that were used in our country were the basic common law and biblical law. And we didn't have any jails or prisons, so if you had to go to trial for committing a crime, your punishment was very swift. And now we're going to go back to the text material, but I want you to remember that the setup of the colonial government, you've got the governor, you've got your counselors to the governor, you've got your elected assembly, and remember the monarchs that created change, like Henry VIII leaving the Catholic Church and forming the Church of England so he could basically grant himself an annulment and get married. Mercantilism. England had, well, she's trying to seize control of the Atlantic coast of the New World, and she wants to consolidate her hold over the entire continent's eastern coast so she can regulate its trade. The colonies' role, according to England, was to serve the interest of the mother country by producing raw materials and importing manufactured goods from England. In other words, keep the gold and the silver in country by bringing in more gold and silver than is going out, and by selling more merchandise than you're buying. This is just a picture of the colonies. You've got down in through here is Spain, and there's an unexplored territory on here. You've got Georgia, Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, all up. And this, of course, is a map back when we had the New Netherlands, back 1864, before England had the war and won. And you got the New Netherlands, which became New York. Let's talk a little bit about slavery, because we'll spend a great deal more time of slavery in another chapter, but right now let's just cover the big broad picture. It's very hard to accept and to understand, but slavery began in Africa. Now, slavery's been around for millions of years. Since the beginning of time, there's always been slavery, but slavery as we know it began in Africa. It seems that when the Africans would have a war, their captives would be held as slaves to either do employment work in town or something, or else if they didn't have anything for them to do, they would sell them to other tribes to do labor. Slavery was not on the same par as American slavery in any way, shape, or form, or of Muslim slavery either, as far as that goes. It was not a disrespectful state to be in. You would become a slave because you'd lost a war or you created a debt you couldn't pay. But it didn't take long for the Africans to realize that these Portuguese sailing up and down their coast were willing to buy slaves to work on their plantations. Well, unfortunately, when the supply of captives ran out, the Africans would go further interior of Africa to capture their own people and take them to the coast, to the slave centers, and sell to ship captains. So you're having black Africans selling black Africans as slaves. As I said, they'd be sold to the ship captains and basically on the West Coast. That's the first part of the passage, the first arm, being transported from the interior to the coast. The middle passage is when they're put on a boat and sent to another part of the world. They would be packed like sardines. From 10 to 20% would die from disease, from exhaustion, from malnutrition. Some were executed. Some even committed suicide. And they would all be forced to exercise on deck because you can't leave them lay for 3 months and expect them to walk. There was no sanitation. They'd have to lay in their own filth. And anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months to make this trip. And most of the slaves were delivered to the Caribbean islands or to South America. Less than 5% were actually transported to North America. Because in the beginning, in the American colonies, or the English colonies, they began their work with indentures. Basically, a man, a woman, child, black or white, would sell their soul, so to speak, for the passage to the New World, for agreed to work from 5 to 7 years. They'd sell their indenture to the ship's captain, and the ship's captain, then in turn, would sell the contract to someone once they reached the New World. And when the indenture or the contract was up, they would receive something called freedom dues, which was, in the beginning, it was usually 50 acres of land and a change of clothes and something to help them get started on their own, if they were still alive, because being an indenture was not an easy task. But buying a slave makes an economically better deal because you didn't have to release them. And whereas if the indenture ran away, he would kind of melt into society. But if the slave ran away, not only did he not know the area, he didn't speak the language, and because of the color of his skin, he'd be easy to find. So economically, the slave was a better deal. Now, the Dutch and the Portuguese were the first slave traders, but the English followed real closely behind with the Royal African Company selling trading in slaves. And slavery began slowly in Virginia, but it very quickly spread to all the tobacco-producing colonies. And all colonies had slaves, whether they were Boston, Massachusetts, whether it was Philadelphia, whether it was Norfolk, Virginia, no matter what it was, all colonies had slaves. But the only colony that began with slavery was South Carolina. Now, I know we talked about slaves in the New Netherland area in New York in last chapter, but I want to get a little bit more detail now. In 1626, 11 slaves arrived in the New Netherlands. And between 1630 and 1650, the West India Company was very dominant in trade throughout the Mediterranean as well as the Atlantic world. By 1644, more than 6,000 slaves were brought to the colonies in the area of New Netherlands. They were brought in from the West Indies after they'd been seasoned, and they were used for clearing forests and laying the roads and building houses and building public buildings and growing food. They were used strictly as laborers, and they were all company owned. But the private settlers objected because they weren't allowed to own slaves. Now, on the supply of slaves, the West Indies, the slaves that had been seized by privateers, well, the people in the New Netherlands did not want those that came from Angola because they were too big, too large, too rough, too treacherous. They were just too hard to handle. Slavery became very important for the agricultural development in the Hudson Valley. Between 1636 and 1646, the price of slaves increased more than 300%. And it wasn't but 20 years later when the New Netherlands went to war with England again over trade and everything else, and they lost this time. So the area called the New Netherlands in the New World became property of England, and the King of England promptly gave the entire area of former New Netherlands to his brother, the Duke of York. Thus we have the New York colony. And the economic status of slaves in the New Netherlands was a lot better off before the English took over. Free blacks were trusted. They served in the militia. They were given arms. They had equal standing in court. They could own property. They could intermarry. And even the company slave could be granted something called half freedom, which we explained last chapter. It's basically where you're still a slave, but you're allowed to go into town and work and live and have certain freedoms, but you still owe obligations to your master and to the company itself. Once the English took over and became settled along the eastern coast, we developed four major slave trading centers: Memphis, New Orleans, Charleston, and Washington, D.C. And I think it's absolutely disgusting that we had slave trading anywhere, but especially in our capital. Now, there's basically two types of slave auctions. There's the grab and go and the highest bidder. And the grab and go is pretty much what it says. The slaves are put in a big pen, and you climb up on a pole or chair, and you look in and you find the slave that you want, and then when the door is open, you run in and you grab that slave and you take him out and you pay for him. And the other one is the one you know the most about. They're put on an auction block basically, and the person who bids the highest gets the slaves. But by 1800, the natural increase of slaves is not keeping up with the need, so we begin to have to trade more and to bring more in from Africa. Now, in the beginning, slavery was really not all that harsh. The slaves were fed well, they were clothed, they were housed, and they were cared for. But slavery, and they weren't too crazy about the whole situation, so some of them would escape. Well, pretty soon we got to develop laws to protect our white man and control this slave population. For instance, in the Virginia colony, in 1662, slavery is being defined as lifelong inherited status passed from mother to child. 5 years later, the law states that just being a Christian did not stop you from being a slave, and there had been some talk about this. 2 years later, the laws passed that gives the power of life or death to the master. 2 years later, the laws passed that it forbids the master from freeing his slave, and the free blacks that are in the colony have to leave. And it's not just Virginia. Kentucky and several of the other states are the same way. Once you become a free slave, we want you nowhere around. You might be giving my slaves bad ideas. But local codes are passed in every colony. But by 1740, the slaves were beginning developing their own New World traditions. I mean, after all, it may look like to the white master that they're bowing down to them, but they're not. They develop secret ways of communicating. They've got songs and chants, and they can figure out ways to get messages to each other. If nothing else, the certain way you hang something on the clothesline might mean something. And in Georgia, they passed laws that there couldn't be any banging of drums or any singing in the fields because they were afraid that the slaves were communicating. And they were right. The slaves were communicating. But there was resistance. Of course there was. What we call active resistance and passive resistance. Active resistance can be something as simple as running away. It could be burning down a building or killing your master. But if you did this, you could be whipped, branded, have the Achilles tendons cut, you could be executed. But passive resistance was much more common. Something as simple as spitting in the master's food. Now, this is not going to make him sick. He doesn't even know you did it. But you know that that man is eating your spit. You could break tools so you couldn't do a job. You could pretend you didn't understand the directions, or you could work slowly. Or you could walk to the fields in the morning very slowly. When you get there, you break your hoe. You have to go all the way back to the plantation to get another hoe and then walk slowly back to the fields. Well, you've wasted half a day. Now, you're not being lazy. That's being smart. Of course, the white master thought you were being lazy and stupid, but you were smart. You were playing the white man like a fiddle. Now, here's John Green again, and he's going to talk to you about slavery, so it's not going to be as funny in this time.
Blacks are thinnest skin. They need special attention day and night. New Chopstick dual-ended hydration lock provides 24-hour care. SPF protects by day. Natural oils replenish by night. Chopstick, put your lips first.
Hi, I'm
I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. Yeah, so we put a lay on the eagle to try to cheer you up, but let's face it, this is going to be depressing. With slavery, everything you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad. It turns out to have been much worse. Mr. Green, but what about even the best? I'm going to stop you right there because you're going to embarrass yourself. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1865. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. But slavery is most important because we still struggle with its legacy. So yes, today's episode will probably not be funny, but it will be important. So the slave-based economy in the South is sometimes characterized as having been separate from the market revolution, but that's not really the case. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize, at least not as quickly, because cotton textiles were one of the first industrially produced products and the most important commodity in world trade by the 19th century. And 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. And speaking of cotton, why has no one mentioned to me that my collar has been half popped this entire episode, like I'm trying to recreate the Flying Nun's hat? And although there were increasingly fewer slaves in the North as northern states outlawed slavery, cotton shipments overseas made northern merchants rich, northern bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations, northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, after all, considered property and very valuable property. And in addition to turning cotton into cloth for sale overseas, northern manufacturers sold cloth back to the South, where it was used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it. But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially king cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all Southern urbanization took place in the upper South, further away from the large cotton plantation. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. Like, there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, and as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suffer the Civil War, thankfully. In short, slavery dominated the South, shaping it both economically and culturally. And slavery wasn't a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. Although in the popular imagination, most plantations were these sprawling affairs with hundreds of slaves, in reality, the majority of slaveholders owned 5 or fewer slaves. And of course, most white people in the South owned no slaves at all, although if they could afford to, they would sometimes rent slaves to help with their work. These were the so-called yeoman farmers who lived self-sufficiently, raised their own food, and purchased very little in the market economy. They worked the poorest land, and as a result, were mostly pretty poor themselves. But even they largely supported slavery, partly perhaps for aspirational reasons, and partly because the racism inherent to the system gave even the poorest whites legal and social status. And Southern intellectuals worked hard to encourage these ideas of white solidarity and to make the case for slavery. Many of the founders, a bunch of whom you'll remember held slaves, saw slavery as a necessary evil. Jefferson once wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." The belief that justice and self-preservation couldn't sit on the same side of the scale was really opposed to the American idea, and in the end, it would make the Civil War inevitable. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery because, their masters fed them and clothed them and took care of them in their old age. You still hear this argument today, astonishingly. In fact, you'll probably see asshats in the comments saying that. I will remind you, it's not cursing if you are referring to an actual ass. This paternalism allowed masters to see themselves as benevolent and to contrast their family-oriented slavery with the cold, mercenary capitalism of the free labor North. So yeah, in the face of rising criticism of slavery, some Southerners began to argue that the institution was actually good for the social order. One of the best-known proponents of this view was John C. Calhoun, who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where 2 races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good.
a positive good. Now, of course, John C. Calhoun was a fringe politician, and nobody took his views particularly seriously.
He was the Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845.
Well, I mean, who really cares about the Secretary of State, Stan?
He was also Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825.
All right, but we don't even have a Secretary of War anymore.
And he was Vice President from 1825 to 1832.
Oh my God, were we insane? We were, of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans and with outright racism, arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things, a worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle. God, I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for. He's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations in South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But let's imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time. Bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave of a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm going to whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm going to whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every whip if they hit you. That brutality, the whippings, the branding, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the top level. Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules to the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps one-third of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David. And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Thanks, Doc. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? We're doing two set pieces in a row? All right. The rules here are simple. I wanted to reshoot that, but Stan said no. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am wrong, I get shocked with the shock penalty. Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free. All right, it's definitely a preacher, because only preachers have read Malachi. Probably African-American, probably not someone from the South. I'm going to guess that it is Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ah, dang it! It's Joseph Taper, and Stan just pointed out to me that I should have known it was Joseph Taper because it starts out, since I have been in the Queen's dominions. He was in Canada. He escaped slavery to Canada, the Queen's dominions. All right, Canadians, I blame you for this, although thank you for abolishing slavery decades before we did. Ah! So the mystery document shows one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression, by running away. Although some slaves, like Joseph Taper, escaped slavery for good by running away to the northern free states or even to Canada, where they wouldn't have to worry about fugitive slave laws, even more slaves ran away temporarily, hiding out in the woods or the swamps and eventually returning. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year made the journey north. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway has been hanging out behind me all day long, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating, responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings were relatively rare. The 4 most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane, knives, and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed some people, was Nat Turner's in August 1831. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children, because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves from preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slavery had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns, or sabotaging equipment, or pretending not to understand instruction. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out an identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back, and in the end, they won. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Mower. The script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Our associate producer is Danica Johnson.
We will spend a little bit more time on the slave insurrections and slavery again in another chapter. The population of colonies is changing, whereas the first settlers had been predominantly English in both the Massachusetts area as well as the Chesapeake area. Now we're starting to see not just indentured service, but black imported slaves and convicts and Germans and Scot-Irish and later on other nationalities. And we've got a new kind of public developing. We're no longer English. We don't speak the English accent. Most of the people who live in the colonies by this time have never even been to England. The Germans seem to migrate to the back country of Pennsylvania for the farmland, so we get the Pennsylvania Dutch. The Scotch and Irish, they either went further west or south into Virginia and South Carolina. The Dutch stayed pretty much around New York, and the Swiss stayed pretty much around the Delaware Valley. But because of the growing population, we begin to see social stratification, and classes did develop. Although we like to say we're a classless society, we're not. Now, the aristocracy, and no, it's not noble. We don't have nobility in this country, but they would be the clergy, the professional people, the wealthy merchants, the large landowners, because then, as now, your economic status or achievement determined your social status. The middle class is growing. Oh, it's growing by leaps and bounds, and it's a lot larger than the first class or the aristocracy. And this is your smaller farmers, your tradespeople, your artisans. And then your third class. It's unhealthy large. It's the unskilled, the unpropertied laborers. They're free people, but they don't own any land, and they wander from place to place. And it's the type of people or the class of people that our founding fathers were afraid of, because they'd had no loyalty to any specific area. And of course, the fourth class, your indentures or your black slaves. Now, even though we have people in Boston, and we have people in Philadelphia, and we have people in Virginia, and we have people in South Carolina, and they all settled for different reasons, and they have, different climate changes. There is some unifying forces. I mean, they all use English laws. They all pretty much speak the English language. Even if you're a foreigner coming in, you start speaking English language pretty rapidly. We use the English literature, the English customs, and of course, we're all immigrants. And we all need protection against those dastardly Indians, and we all have politics in our local economies. So even though those are unifying factors, we do have divisive forces. And the biggest one, of course, is geography. I mean, it's a long way from Boston, Massachusetts to Charleston, South Carolina. You've got rivers and vacant land, and just the unbelievable distance, and there's no airplanes, there's no railroads. I mean, most of your travel's by foot, and each of your areas have different economic interests. And of course, there is the class differences. You've got the moneyed eastern seaboard merchants, you've got the rich southern plantation owners, and you've got the small and or your western farmer and your yeoman. And of course, each region has its own needs. I mean, the people out west in the western colonies, they need gunpowder. The people of Boston don't need gunpowder. They need somebody to help work and build ships. And there's disputes between the colonies over the boundaries of where the colonies end. There's disputes over tariffs. You actually charge tariff from one colony to the next. It'd be like you have this big toll gate between us and North Carolina, and you say you can't come into South Carolina unless you pay this big toll. And of course, each colony seems to feel that they have their own autonomy. They want their own military. They want to issue their own paper money. They're just like their own little countries. But disregarding all that for a few minutes, overall, New England is the one that's going to emphasize the value of education. Prior to this time in Europe, education was not seen as anything that was necessary. The only people that need to be educated were the priests, maybe, or the monarchs. And you didn't need to know how to read and write to birth children or plow a field. But by 1647, education was provided by law in the New England area, and it became compulsory in 1689. You could actually be punished if you didn't educate your child, except for Rhode Island. The middle colonies believed that the education of the children was up to the church. And the southern colonies, because we didn't have any cities, it was large individual farms, you had private tutors. And there again, the eldest son of the plantation owner may need to be educated, but he didn't need that much education to keep books. If you wanted to be a minister or a lawyer, you could go away for school, but for the most part, education was seen as something that wasn't necessary. But just for your information, there were 9 colleges formed, but they were not formed to teach you how to earn a living. It was basically founded to teach you how to become a good minister, an educated minister, and a leader of the church. And by 1639, just a little over 25 years after we first started settling, we had our first newspaper published. And by 1704, we had our first regularly published weekly paper. In 1739, we had our first almanac. In 1741, we had our first magazine published, and it was a gentleman's magazine. By 1740, Philadelphia became known as the literary center of the colonies. And the Enlightenment went on in Europe. Oh man, it's going to affect a lot of stuff going on in our country because we're no longer going to accept the dogma of the church, be it Protestant or Catholic. We're going to question things. We're going to observe things and see how they work. We're going to experiment, and we're going to end up changing a lot of our ideas on things. But the different areas are going to develop, of course, different economies. For instance, in New England, you've got a seaport, and you've got ocean-going vegetables, not vegetables, vessels and trade, and you build ships. The southern colonies are depending mostly on agriculture and tobacco and rice, and of course, indigo for our Carolinas. You get the large plantations developing in the south. Now, in the middle colonies, you know, New York and New Jersey, Pennsylvania, these are called our breadbasket colonies. They where all the grain is grown, the wheat and the corn. And whereas in New England, the rocky soil, it makes it so that you can farm for self-sufficiency, but you can't really farm to make any money. And the people who had farms even, they lived in town and would go out of town to do their work on their farms. The middle colonies were basically large farms, and the southern colonies, large plantations and small plantations. But what about those western colonies? Well, migration west had been going on. I mean, it seems like the colonists had itchy feet. I mean, they no sooner get an area settled and they want to move on further west. But for them, life was very hard and very simple. They had to be very self-reliant because, I mean, you're hundreds of miles away from anything back east. And, of course, the colonial aristocracy ignored you because you were backwoodsy, you know. And, of course, the people out in the West, they did not like those northern eastern businessmen. They thought they were too money hungry. As far as industry, as I said, in New England, you had the shipbuilding and the importing and exporting. In the South, you had some industry, not a lot, but I mean, you had the pitch and the tar and the turpentine industry, and you had the sawmills. And the middle colonies had little or no industry at all. And all the colonies, New England, the southern, the middle, or even the western colonies, they all engaged in the fur trade. And with all the expansion and growth, it's a desperate need for workers. Of course, in the beginning, you had the indentures, and they had to be released after a certain period of time. And before you know it, there was fewer and fewer come to this land. The Indians, you couldn't get them to work either through slavery or pay no, because the kind of work that you wanted them to do, they considered woman's work. Women worked in the fields, men didn't. So slaves was the best economic choice. And it wasn't because the color of your skin, it was because you had more land than you had workers. So, and you also didn't have to release them, they were yours for life. So economically, buying an African slave was the best economic choice. So slavery in the beginning did not begin because of skin color or religion. It began because of a simple lack of laborers. And that being said, we will close chapter 3.